Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and welcome to this talk. Obviously, it would be strange to be sitting in a talk titled Men Design, so why women design? And it would be stupid to ignore history, I think, and jump straight to an acceptance that we are working in a neutral gendered discipline, that it is equally balanced. And to that end, I wanted to highlight what I see as an imbalance, and what I have spent the last year writing a book about, which is available outside through You Read Me. We'll be doing the signing after the talk. But I wanted to sort of choose some examples through the book that explained why there has been historically a gender imbalance within the design industry, but then also to celebrate the breadth and diversity of design by using examples from people as varied as Eileen Gray through Norma Merrick-Sklarek, the first Black American architect, through to contemporary practitioners like Patrizia Urquiola and Helle Jongerius. But unfortunately, choosing them was very difficult because historically, design has been written about men by men. And so doing the research for a book like this was difficult, and finding images and getting access to archives was not as easy as you would have thought. So sitting here under this amazing ceiling full of design history and contemporary practitioners, we have to really start to question why there is a disparity in the industry, why historically there was one and why it continues. Since the first wave of feminist design historians started asking where did all the women go in the 1980s, there has been quite a large leap forward in design, feminist design history, but I think most would agree that the job is far from done. And in the last 2 years, yes, certainly we've seen countless international women's marches, the Time's Up and #MeToo campaigns, fighting against sexual harassment, the exposure of gender pay gaps, and in the UK, the centenary this year of the women's right to vote. But despite all these campaigns and the protests and the upheaval, the design industry is lagging behind. Research, and sorry, I'm going to read this so I don't get my statistics wrong. Research from Universities UK conducted a survey in 2013 that found that 60% of students studying art or design-related subjects were women. But in 2015, the British Design Council did another survey that found that women make up less than 1/4 of the workforce. So we're losing them somewhere between education and the senior professional roles. We can no longer exist that the problem doesn't exist, even if we'd like to think it doesn't exist. To those who rightly believe that gender should not matter and that we should judge people on merit and talent, we also have to acknowledge that these latent prejudices within the industry are already repressing an overwhelming majority of that industry. So it's time to do something about it. And to that end, I've invited a panel of wonderful speakers today to join me to talk about their personal experiences and projects they've been working on. From Nina Yashar, founder of the internationally acclaimed design gallery based in Milan, Nilüfer Gallery, through to Marianne Goebl, who's director of the Finnish brand Artek, which was founded in 1935, so has become a Finnish institution amongst, an amazing furniture brand. But she was also director of Design Miami for many years, so we'll probably feel quite comfortable sitting here. And then Betil Dagdelen, who is a designer whose beautiful work can be seen in Christina Grahalis's gallery upstairs. I've invited them each to speak about a very specific topic, so we'll go through each in turn, and then we can open up the floor to any questions that might come out of these discussions. So, Nina, in April this year, Nina and her team at Nilüfer presented what was unanimously described as the highlight of the annual furniture fair in Milan, a presentation of the work of the Italian-born but Brazilian-based architect Lina Bo Bardi. And that presentation is actually recreated behind us in Design at Large, and if you haven't had a chance to go and look at it, I highly recommend you carve your way through to see it. It was a presentation of Lina's work with the furniture collaborator Giancarlo Pelant, a body of work, furniture pieces that they'd made together in Brazil. Now, as I mentioned, Lina was born, I'm going to get confused between Lina and Nina here, sorry. Lina was born in Italy but moved to Brazil with her husband in 1946, and discovering a lack of furniture manufacturing industry set up this studio to produce work. But Lina was also an architect of buildings, public and private, modern and traditional. She was an editor, she was an illustrator, a curator, a teacher, a museum director, a furniture designer and set designer. But despite this extraordinary body of work, she's not particularly well known, or at least wasn't until the last 2 decades. And certainly most surveys on Brazilian architecture have overlooked her in favor of highlighting people like Oscar Niemeyer or Lucio Costa. But nor has she received the professional accreditation that many of her female colleagues or collaborators have achieved, people like Charlotte Perriand, Eileen Gray, Ray Eames, or Lily Reich. So, but despite all of this, she actually created much more than any of those people that I've just mentioned. So perhaps it's more than just gender, because she was certainly given lots of opportunities, and perhaps the issue with Lina Bo Bardi was the fact that she was working in Brazil at a time where Brazil became deeply unfashionable. In the 1960s, the world's focus moved away from Brazil due to the regime changes that were going on in the country, the politics that were going on in the public, and the cultural shift moved to North America, where the complexity and contradiction of postmodernism was starting to take hold. So modernism also fell out of favor. And so that might be some of the reasons why Lina perhaps had not been identified until more recently, and certainly since her death in 1992. So with all that in mind, I want to turn to Nina and ask, first of all, how did you first learn about Lina, and how did you start collecting this beautiful body of work that you've amassed?
I was interested roughly 5 years ago in Brazilian design furnitures, so always something new to propose as content in my gallery. So I decided to collect generally Brazilian designers, vintage Brazilian designers. And for sure when I went in São Paulo, I came up in the Casa do Vidro. And aside the amazing architecture, rationalism in the middle of the forest.
This was Lina Bo Bardi's own home,
Casa
do Vidro.
Exactly, yes. Casa do Vidro, her own home that she built it for herself. And suddenly I was really impressed about this very freedom way of putting furnitures inside this house. So I expressed my dream when I was there. I would love to do an exhibition about Lina Bo Bardi, but it was already only a dream because it was the most difficult challenge in the professional work of a gallerist, because she really produced very, very few. And I said, perhaps I will come up 1, 2, 3 pieces maximum in my life of her pieces. So I started collecting Brazilian pieces, and suddenly 1, 2, 3, and I started to build a little collection. But what really impressed me about her, that it's a little bit in your question, what made me near her in a way. What really impressed me was inside her house, an antique furniture of 19th century, a sculpture of 18th century, and then an anonymous chair, and then her pieces. So the combination, and they all coexist in a so natural way as she was actually. This, I think, really fascinated me, because it's a little bit my way to see pieces, to put them all together without any connection of age, period, geographical areas. So this really attracted me, and it has been the biggest challenge of my career sincerely.
Was that because of limited access to pieces, or?
Very limited access to pieces, and then strongly difficult to find them, and then very difficult to understand if they were real or not.
Original
or not, exactly. So that's why I asked when I did the collection, after 3 years, I wanted to commit the Istituto Bardi Casa do Vidro. I put under their control all the collection to understand if it was correct what I did.
Yeah. And how supportive, I guess, was the foundation, the Bardi Foundation, in helping you access more works? Because you obviously found more than two or three pieces.
I found, yes, they didn't help me to find, absolutely not. They are very conservative and they are very strict. And they were very severe in judging the pieces. And actually, it has been the most difficult thing I did in my life, because they decided that 10 pieces, they were not Lina Bo Bardi, that internationally are considered to be of her.
No.
But the most important thing that it sought out about this exhibition is through the investigation, the scientific investigation that they did, it sought out a real big discovery, the name of Giancarlo Pelant, that was working with Lina since 1948 and 1951, and Miss Anna Carboncini of the Istituto. She found out, after me pushing to do research in a Habitat of 1951, that Lina Bo Bardi declared that the zigzag and the famous tridente were designed by Giancarlo Pelanti.
Wow. Okay.
So this has been the biggest discovery after the investigation. So it has been very...
Yeah. Habitat was the magazine that Lina
was
curating and editing
herself in Brazil, in São
and yet
Paulo.
the Institute had not made that connection before you.
No.
That's. But I mean, what other anecdotes did you can you share with us on that journey, that you did 5 years ago, over the last 5 years, in discovering Lina's work?
So first, I was for sure attracted, as everybody talks about her after her death. Everybody started to talk about her as an architect. And for sure I went to see the Sesc Pompeia, everything that I had to see. And but what I really wanted to do, it was to investigate her as a designer, because actually there are not books about her on design. Mm. So this was really my goal and my intention to do something for her that I really loved. And then we discovered anecdotes about her through Anna Carboncini, that she was using to do every Sunday around her table lunch, Lebanese lunch. And I didn't know, and my lunch was Lebanese in Milano, so this was very strange, sincerely.
Why do you think she was serving Lebanese lunches in Brazil?
Because she was very curious. She loved the Lebanese cuisine.
Fantastic. She travelled a lot then, can we assume?
Yes.
Okay, because a lot of the accounts I came across in researching really didn't talk about her leaving Brazil, but I've seen pictures of her in Japan, and now you're saying potentially also going to the Lebanon.
She was very open-minded, 360 degrees. She was very curious. Everything was under her, captured her attention.
So why do you think she was overlooked for so long?
Because after her death, people started to investigate and to discover her only as an architect. And then there were curators and people, they studied her life, her personal life. So they started to talk about her architect and also books on her personal life. For example, Zeuler de Lima, that is a curator who participated to the talk in the depot about her. He says she could be my wife because I studied 12 years her personal life. So, but nobody took care about her design, and they talked about her as a curator, as a scenographer, as a writer, as a design jewelries, but they didn't investigate at all about her.
But I mean, all of this has happened since she died
Since she died.
But nobody was talking about her when she was alive.
No,
and she was
absolutely.
known in Brazil, but not outside of Brazil.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
She was really not considered.
There was an exhibition of her work in 1989, I think, in Sao Paulo. I think I'm getting right. And it was the first time her work had ever been exhibited. And she died, quite at an elderly age, 3 years later. So, quite a lot of catching up had to be done after she passed away.
Yes.
And I hope that you've all had a chance to look at some of these images that are scrolling through, showing
This is
her
the
work.
Studio d'Arte Palma. No,
This is the installation,
this is the installation
from Milan this year.
in Milan, yes.
And
These are the two pieces of Giancarlo Pelant that they discovered. And this is the cover of Habitat of 1951.
And this is her own house that she built.
And this is Casa do Vidro, her house. These are the interiors of Casa do Vidro. You can see the statue, the sculpture. And this is the very interesting picture that I love, because this is the Studio d'Arte Palma.
This is where they made the furniture?
Yes, they founded Studio d'Arte Palma with the help of her husband, Pietro Maria Bardi, and Giancarlo Pelant, because they came in 1946 in Brazil to sell the antique works of Pietro Maria Bardi.
Yes, he was a very famous collector and curator at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then they fall in love with Brazil, and they founded Casa d'Arte Palma, that it was with antique, as you can see, with antique furniture, paintings, and her new designs. So I find this very, very interesting.
The composer and musician John Cage described Lina Bo Bardi's architecture as an architecture of freedom. I think that's what you were describing when you first discovered her house, that there were no rules, no division between style, material, age, epoch, anything.
Absolutely.
And do you feel then that the pieces that you've got represented here are a good expression of this breaking down of boundaries and barriers?
Yes, because for sure her collection represents her background, her cultural background of rationalism that she had that it was part of her genius of her culture that was in Italy. But when she came up, she arrived in Brazil, she forgot completely only a sort of rationalism that we can feel. But after she was open to use everything that was used there in Brazil without any
hierarchy.
Exactly. Yeah. So she used all the woods in Brazil, and the way of upholstery some pieces, because the humid weather couldn't allow to have many upholstery things. So she did upholstery with air that passed through the textile, the fabric, and she adapted completely her knowledge where in the country that she was living.
Yeah.
So this was very interesting, completely open, and the famous sedia da strada that she invented because she was waiting for a bus, and she invented the three wood
the legs.
See, the tree wood that they borrowed in our... and she invented this for chance, for people to sit in the road. So everything was so instinctive.
Yeah. She also has been described as doing, what's the phrase, architecture pauvre. Well, it's pauvre in French, but using the indigenous and the local, and mixing that with, as you're saying, with her very European historical roots, to be able to, to, I guess, bring a new language into Brazilian design, but now also international design.
Yes, absolutely. And she was, at the end, the first person who built the Brazilian design.
Yeah. I mean, an amazing woman that
Amazing, yes.
Please read the book, but also go and have a look at Nina's presentation next door. Lina Bo Bardi really does deserve a lot more credit than she was given during her lifetime, but I'm delighted that people like Nina are putting so much effort into rediscovering her pieces and telling her story, and particularly furniture. As you say, nothing has been written about it, so thank you for that. But what's an interesting link, if I can move on to Marianne. Marianne, as I mentioned, is managing director of Artek, which is a company that's more than just a brand. It's sort of a national heritage, part of Finnish national heritage. And it was founded in 1935 by two Finnish architects, Alva and Aino Aalto, and their like-minded friends. I'm going to get this wrong, sorry. Mayor Gulliksen.
Not bad.
Close enough. And Niels Gustav Hau, who came from the art world. And they created this manifesto or a platform from which they wanted to disseminate a discussion about modern art, design, interiors, and education. So very similar, I guess, to what we were just talking about with Lina Bo Bardi, the sort of blurring or breaking down of hierarchies and conventions and disciplines to create this environment where like-minded people could come and engage with the ideology and also, not coincidentally, buy Aalto's furniture. But like many husband and wife teams, say, for example, think of Charles and Ray Eames or Massimo and Lella Vignelli, or even Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, it's very difficult to separate the contributions that Aino and Alva Aalto respectively brought to their architecture and their brand of Artek. And indeed, you have to question whether we should be looking to try and create divisions and ascribe a separation onto the firm. But all of this meant that Aino, who unfortunately died very early, and who had been a practicing architect before she'd married Alvo, was lost to history, and her great contribution to Artek as a brand was overlooked. So with that in mind, I wanted to turn to Marianne and ask, in your role as managing director, what you thought Aino Aalto, in her role as creative director, brought to the brand Artek, and how that might, those contributions, how or if her contributions are still contributing to the brand today.
Well, I think for us at Artek, Aino is something like the quintessential modern woman. I mean, born at the end of the 19th century, a trained architect, so that is a bit of a Finnish exception because they accepted female students much earlier than the rest of Europe. So trained architect, a practicing architect, interior designer, and furniture designer, a businesswoman, wife of a superstar architect of the time, mother of two, and yet also a strong-minded, independent personality. So she's been described of having been of exceptional human integrity. So she's something like a moral compass, and somehow she hovers over Artek, but not in an oppressive way at all, more in a comforting and an inspiring way. It's interesting what you said about this collaboration between Alvar and Aino, because, of course, first of all, he lived 30 years longer than she did. And I think that, of course, he lived on and created. And as you said, in many creative partnerships, it's very hard to tell apart who does what. And that's not a gender question. It's just a very personal working relationship between two people. And often these there's this cumulative effect between partners. No, together they are more than 1 + 1, and they come to intensify their exchange to something like a telepathic communication. And it's very hard to say from the outside, and I think it's also not our role now to dissect who did what. But what was interesting in the case of the altos, that the fact that they were communicating on eye level was actually made visible. So Aino Alto joined Alvar Aalto's architecture office in 1924. He was 26 years old, she was 3 or 4 years older, so they were both at the beginning of their careers. And if you look at the early letterheads, it already said Aino and Alvar Aalto, so it was not Studio Alvar Aalto and she was the secretary. They were on eye level. But however, the contributions to the architectural projects that she made at the studio, they shouldn't be underestimated, but they're hard to measure. But at Artek, she had a very official role. She was the company's first artistic director. And when the managing director sadly passed away during the war, she also took over the role of managing director until her own death. So she was coining the early years of the company. And as you said, this company was started as a real project of modernism. Huh? So we're in 1935 in Finland, which is a very young nation. It had been under Russian regime until 1917. So somehow the nation finding of Finland coincided with Aalto's start as a career as an architect, plus Artek is a place that they created as a center for the new housing ideology, which sounds programmatic, and it was programmatic. You saw somewhere here this crazy document with typewritten and many arrows. And what they wanted it to be was a place where you could discover modern art, interior design, industrial design, and propaganda in the sense of education. And what they wanted to do was to integrate art and design in daily life. They wanted to integrate art and technology. That's also the name, no? Art and tech coming together. They wanted to experiment. They wanted to, but they wanted also to follow certain modernist credos, which was to make the best available for the most. So they strongly believed in standardization of production. So they wanted to make the products that Alvar and Aino Aalto designed accessible to as many people as possible in the entire world. So it says in this manifest, it said, for worldwide activity. So these people were not naive, but they were also not modest. No, they set out to say, we believe in this idea and we're gonna conquer the world. And I think she was the motor of all this on the furniture side. On the art side, there was Marianne Goebl. So she was really focusing on the interior design projects and on the furniture side of things. And I think there's a few things that really strongly resonate with us today at Artek, but I hope that they're also of a bit more universal relevance. I mean, this question of standardization, you know, producing standardized design elements for architecture or furniture, that was obviously not invented by the Aaltos. But I think they brought it to another level because they thought beyond just the rational. They didn't only want to think in terms of production logic. They wanted to put the user, the human being, back into the focus. So whether they were thinking of psychological and physiological needs as much as how do I produce this and how do I ship this out of Finland. So they were doing this in wood. If you think most of the furniture of the time, the modern furniture, it was tubular steel furniture. It was the furniture's machine. But they, living in Finland, first of all, wood was rather omnipresent. I mean, of course, they had metal, but wood was a resource that was at hand. But they also thought that it was a material you actually wanted to live with, that you wanted to touch, that had a sensuality to it that you wanted to have in an interior. But they also thought that standardization should allow them to play and experiment. So apparently, new employees were always asked by Aino to redraw existing designs, which was like a key practice. So rather than designing new furniture for every new project, she asked them to adapt what was already there for different needs. So would it be to take a table and just to cut off the legs for a kindergarten, or would it be to work with different materials, resize dimensions? So they were not caught in their own standards, but they were playing with them. And I think this, in a way, human approach to standardization is something we still try to pursue today. She was said to have had a very keen eye for aesthetic qualities of both an object and an interior. So she could judge the quality of something through a mix of instinct and education. And but she was also an innovator. Think of changes in technology. We're looking at the 1930s. Finland, at the periphery of Europe, only just started to integrate electrical lighting in apartments. So they started to design electrical lighting. And she also really was interested in materials, like studying alternative materials, the properties of materials, the structure, etc. And I think this, detailed interest in materials and also something like balancing proportions of forms and objects, this is something that's core for Artek products and interiors. And she famously attached, when she was working on an interior project for a client, and she was attaching small fabric samples so that a client who was maybe not a professional could relate to it in a better way. And this is something that we've continued doing at Artek, and nowadays, of course, everyone does that. But I think in the 1930s in Finland, this was quite a novel approach. Another interesting aspect for me is the network. I mean, we are all sitting here, coming probably from all over the world, being hyper-connected. Again, we're in Finland. You need to, Russia was already not accessible, so you need to take a boat to go anywhere but northern Sweden. And the Altos and their friends, they were highly connected. They traveled all over the world. They were part of the International Congress of Modern Architects. And they had this incredible outreach to like-minded architects, but also to suppliers for the Artek store, because there was a store, and they traveled and found Moroccan carpets and textiles from France and Switzerland, and we have a famous zebra fabric. Maybe this was the cow application of it, but Aino found it on her travels in the 1930s, and we still have it in the collection today. So they were incredibly international. Which I'm in awe of, because of course today it's easy, but back then you had to make an effort. But being part of a movement is also something that still drives us today. And then finally, I think it's approaching design in a holistic way, not looking at the different object typologies independently, like she did everything. She designed glass, she designed lights, she designed textiles, she designed furniture, she designed over 80 interiors. And I think having such a broad, creative output also allowed for this kind of total interiors. I mean, I've put some examples in the presentation where you see this was the first store. Today, you would probably call it a concept store, because it had everything here from the famous Moroccan carpets to plants. But I think this looking at the interior, from this holistic perspective is something we are also still trying to do today.
But actually, you're using words like holistic and standardization in the same sentence there, which was really very radical for the time, and it's only really now that those two words will comfortably sit together in 21st century context. Standardization to most modernists wasn't human, it was machine, and they weren't designing for humans, they were designing for the machine. So in that sense, I think, did bring this wonderful aspect of humanization and democratization through words like standardization into design, which I think was particular to her or Northern Europeans who worked with natural materials and engaged with the beautiful landscape that they were encountering on a daily basis, bringing that into the home as opposed to cold, hard metals, which they moved away from pretty quickly, as you said. But one thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was the adapting of existing work, which, as we know, a little furniture shop down the road called Vitra have actually really just started to do in the last couple of years through their work with Helle Jongerius, who, when they invited her, and you'll know, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when they invited her to work with them, she refused to design new product and instead said, no, what you've got is this amazing collection. Why don't we just revisit that through adapting what you've already got? So an idea that, again, I know brought to the industry, which only now is starting to be appreciated for its commercial value, but also its sustainability value. You're not sort of designing more, you're just working with the existing. So again, a fantastic pioneering lady who didn't work with convention, I guess, and rewrote some of the rule books of how to design, but also how to sell. And you're one of the heirs, I guess, benefiting from that great legacy.
Benefiting and being slightly intimidated, but we're doing our best to give her justice. Yeah.
I'm glad that you included the picture of the restaurant because it has the lights in it, which are upstairs.
True.
In the Design Miami Basel restaurant.
They are, yeah.
As are the stools.
It's a restaurant that the Altos designed in 1937, and this is one of the projects that's clearly credited to Aino. So she did the entire interior, which doesn't mean that she did all of the products, but she arranged them and created the whole framework for it.
No, a lovely lady, and it's a great shame that she did die so early in her career, because I'm sure that manifesto would have been pretty spectacular.
I'm
if she'd
pretty
lived
sure
it
in
through.
her case, the fact that outside of Finland she's actually hardly known is because of her untimely death, because she was not denied. She was not denied a spot in the limelight in this working relationship, neither with her husband nor with her partners at Artek.
No, but also, as you said, Finland had a much more progressive attitude towards women architects and designers at the time anyway. So,
they did.
I mean, the Bauhaus only started, the famous German school, which Walter Gropius initiated in 1918, was one of the first institutes in the rest of Europe to start actively encouraging professional women designers. But in Finland, it had been happening for at least 2 decades before. So, yeah, she was ahead of her time. Unlike, though, Lina Bo Bardi and Aino Aalto, I did not have the privilege of writing about Betil Dagdelen's work in the book. And please, if you haven't been upstairs to Christina Grajalis's booth, Betil's work are the three amazing textile-based pieces. Textile and weaving has always been historically associated with women. And there are many great examples of historical works both upstairs and actually across the road in Art Basel. But Betil, rather than continuing traditions, is sort of pioneering new methods through her work and approaches by literally breaking with pattern, breaking convention. She invents a pattern and then decides to break it, which is made even more complex, I guess, by the fact that you don't work on a loom. You weave onto the structures or the forms that end up becoming the objects. And to tie that back to my research, if I may, I often found that most of the women that inspired me, or indeed most of the most inspiring women in design, were able to establish their careers by breaking new ground, by setting up practices in pioneering new fields where there were no gatekeepers, no barriers to their work, which enabled them to be able to progress. And so even though, unfortunately, Volume 2, fingers crossed, even though I haven't been able to relate your work in this publication, this idea of convention, groundbreaking, pioneering is something that is, I think, very much at the heart of both probably your practice and your life, I think. In preparing for this talk, Betil mentioned that is Turkish-born but now based in the States. But your childhood, your domestic environment, you grew up surrounded by textiles, and that they played, a really important part in your development. So perhaps no surprise that having actually started your career in production and set design, and you moved into textile. But even your shift from Turkey to the US was about breaking with the convention and the expectation of where you may have been thought to have gone. So, having set all that up, please may I invite you to talk about, your decisions to work with textile as a medium, particularly as it is such a medium that is about repetition and theme and structure and rigidity and the loom and the warp and the weft, and then how you go about setting that up only to then break it all.
Well, that's why I was interested in weaving, because it was just one of the art forms that I was able to show the break in a pattern really fast. I mean, I literally can weave this whole wall, and then if I make 2 mistakes or 2 changes, alterations, your eye will immediately go to that. So I just wanted to play with that notion a lot, and then break the patterns in a way. And the way I work is I write the patterns, I master them in my own way, and I get really fast at doing it, and it's very tempting to follow it and finish the piece, but then you break it at a place where you really understand the pattern, and then it starts looking quite harmonious. So I try to take this to life as well, of just how you understand the patterns you make in life, and understand why you're making them, and then break them where it needs to be broken, basically. It's quite refreshing exercise. Yeah. And weaving, like you mentioned, I was surrounded with textiles in Turkey growing up. I never wove there. I actually do not even come from art background. But my family was very into textiles. They were great collectors, and I watched throughout the whole time how they summarized and winterized the house with textiles, and they used textiles as an interior element. My mom would change all the curtains and all the rugs when it becomes summer, and she would just winterize the house and start putting rugs on the walls, and it kept it quiet and the heat and everything. So I knew how much it added to interiors, textiles in general. And when I began weaving, I realized how much work it takes. I mean, they say weavers don't need watches, they need calendars, because you just endless hours of weaving. And so I decided that it should be, this much work should be touched and sat on and felt, and that you have to interact with it. So that's how I started using furniture as my loom, so that you could interact with it and sit on it and feel it. Yeah.
What are the? Sorry, I'm going to. What are the? I mean, these pieces not so much, but what are the metal furniture pieces that I've seen in some of the images? What are they? How do you make them yourself?
I design the frames, and that specific piece is one of the new tries. I always have to have a fixed frame, and I traveled to Navajo Nation in New Mexico, and because I realized that's the technique I'm using. Navajo is upright; it's like a rug. And they couldn't even wrap their head around how I was doing this, because there was weaving is all about tension, and you release the tension. So I work with a fixed frame, so it was really tough. So what I do is I start using thinner materials and thicker materials in order to adjust the tension, so that the weaving holds itself. So that specific coffee table is the first time I actually tried working without a square or a rectangle, and I just realized that I can do and weave around shapes as well with this technique. So, but I design my own frames, and I have them fabricated, and I weave around them. Yeah.
So I did interrupt you because you were just telling us about Navajo and that being a technique, a style of weaving, of the practice that you learnt. But you have travelled extensively, I think, throughout South America, learning from. Could you share some of the stories?
Sure. It was I collaborated with weaving communities in Peru, in Sacred Valley, in order to do this wall installation. And I was very surprised by, I mean, they are master weavers. That backstrap weaving is just something I can't even myself wrap my head around. But they just don't really take it another step. And when I was collaborating with them, one thing that was interesting was the older ladies, they just didn't like working with me, or they just didn't, it was so out of tradition what I was trying to make with them, create with them. But it was the younger generation and the girls who were just as good weavers that were, they surrounded me and they wanted to work with it. So this is something I'm really interested in, is to use the very traditional nation's young generation and just to push them more towards how they can use this ancient technique in doing other things. And these chairs I'm doing, as you're looking right now, are a bit of like forcing the limits of what weaving can do and how it can hold. I try to avoid unnecessary welding in my pieces and let weaving do the job, because it's really,
So
really strong.
The structure underneath the chair, is that what you mean?
Yeah, like this one. This one especially is just loose pipes, steel pipes, and they're only held together by weaving. They are not woven, and it just creates this movement in the pieces. It adapts your body when you sit down. So I like that play of it. And often I get asked if they're strong enough, but I remind people, you walk on rugs, and it lasts centuries. So the older it gets, the more beautiful it looks. So it's a very, very strong form of producing, so I really want to elevate that in my pieces. Yeah.
I don't know whether this is projecting, but you talk about the breaking and the pattern and the seeing, immediately identifying a mistake if it were there, which is actually quite an Islamic tradition, is it not? Nothing is as perfect as God, therefore you must build in mistakes into your work.
Yeah.
Am I projecting, or is there some kind of
No,
reference to that? Given
I don't at
origins?
this point believe in the word mistake when I do this much changes, because unless we make mistakes, there would be no way of making new patterns. The only way to make a new pattern is to make a mistake in the patterns you're doing right now, and then you have these new patterns. So yeah, it is a bit of a continuation of the whole, it keeps going on and on and on, and it's never a mistake. I look at it that way, yeah.
Can I ask just a really practical question then, in terms of the pattern? So you've got a series of 6 chairs, but will each chair be different?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so
it will be. I am unable to do what I've done before. So, it usually is like a mural, and it's like a diary I keep of what's happening. With this piece, the one that you just saw, I began and I don't usually design my patterns. It just kind of comes to me as I'm weaving it. And I took this trip to Costa Rica in the middle, and I had this very profound experience with the snake. So I came back, and there was nothing else I could do but weave the skin of the snake in there. So it becomes kind of like your diary of how you're keeping your mind and thoughts, and like
a travelogue.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the chairs, they usually match. It's just a continuous thing. I know they are numbered and they go on, and if it could be changed around, I don't mind at all. But it is a mural of continuation. Yeah.
And colour is obviously very important
very
to you.
Important to me.
So
right.
Could you talk a bit about how you work with colour and the choices that you make with, the comparisons and contrasts?
Yeah, I always know the colours I want to work with. It's inspired by my travels or something. That's what I know when I begin the colours, and then the patterns come and shape around the colours. I do not dye my own yarn. If I did that, I don't think I would ever finish a piece. But I work with churro yarn, which is naturally dyed, and it's very hardy. It's 2-ply yarn, so it's very hefty. And ropes. These pieces, I make my own ropes. I produce my own ropes in order to weave. And these are thicker ropes that I weave with. And the bench, the alloy bench, those are just individually made ropes. I love mixing patterns. And again, breaking the patterns, and it's just idea is to make it harmonious to your eye, but when you really go macro in it, it's quite chaotic, actually.
There is, I think it's this piece which
This
is
does with
upstairs.
the snake skin, yeah, in the middle. And I went right back to what I was doing after, yeah. And coming from set design background, like all these designers you've mentioned, I like working with different materials. I use a lot of metal, hemp in my pieces. Different ropes, I make my own ropes. But the fabrication of it, I'm very into it. I've been working with fabricators for a long time through set design. So it added quite a valuable input to my work.
So where to next? I mean, Navajo, Peru, where's the next destination that the travelogue continues?
I think Japan will be my next.
Now that would be
piece.
interesting to see how.
I just love their perfection and everything, and their dyeing techniques are amazing, and the ropes, and yeah, I'm very excited to do.
But if you found issues dealing with the elderly Peruvian ladies because they didn't want you to break their patterns, how are you going to do that
Let's
in
go
Japan?
break their patterns.
Fantastic. When do you have a time scale for that development?
Hopefully, end of 2018, I'm going to do a trip for a collaboration for a hotel. Yeah.
Oh, that would be amazing to watch.
Yeah.
And where in the States, where, I mean, with Christina we can see your work, but where else can we see more of your work?
I specifically show with Christina at the moment. You're all welcome for a studio visit in my studio in Brooklyn. There's a couple of restaurants. I did installations in Brooklyn. Peruvian, that's what the Peruvian, both their restaurants have wall hanging pieces, which are one of the few wall hangings I've done. Again, I want you to actually interact with it rather than hanging on the wall. But it is the only color in the restaurant. They kept it very white, and then so I'm very. It's a good one to add in there.
Interesting. You make that division between interacting, it being an object that you sit on, touch. I mean, it's sit on mainly, isn't it? You've done some lights, I know.
I've done some lights. Yes, I did.
But one of the designers I have written about in the book, Annie Albers, who was a great textile designer who moved from, had trained at the Bauhaus and moved to the States at the beginning of the Second World War. She saw her hangings as interaction with architecture, not just interaction with the body. So in a way, I might try and convince you to think of wall hangings as not just passive pieces that don't interact with anything. They inform their environment. They reflect the sound, reflect light.
Yes.
So it's an environmental interaction.
It's spatially, textiles should be used a lot more. I mean, they can, like we said, the light, the feeling, the sound, the heat mostly. I mean, that's how Turkey kind of keeps the heats on the walls and stops the heat from going out. But it will specifically be for not a wall hanging, but keeping the heat in. I'll market it that way.
There we go.
Yeah.
So having introduced sort of the ideas that each of these fantastic women are working on, I'd like to open it up to the floor to see if you've got any questions for Betil, Marianne, or Nina. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, but I'd prefer the floor to be over to these fantastic ladies. So can I invite anybody? Thank you.
So what do you think will engender more engagement of women in design in general? I mean, like from your perspective of a director of a major furniture brand or as a curator, because I mean, I have a design firm, I'm working in a design firm, and it's very hard to get seniority of women in the design firm to stay in the profession.
Shall I start? I think we need to appreciate gender pay gaps to begin with and acknowledge natural working cycles of, if they choose to go and have families, that there needs to be a relationship with their work that work can reflect or be flexible to acknowledge that. But they're pretty obvious answers in terms of gender. Where I think it really starts is education. And by, as I was saying, more women go into design education than men, but they drop out halfway through. And I think one way of trying to encourage, sort of maintain it or to keep it is by giving role models and showing how women have historically managed to get around the divisions, be they gender, be they race, be they geopolitics, whatever, that they've managed to succeed. I don't think it's specific to, it's not specific to design, but women have historically suffered through lack of confidence. I'm not saying that's every single woman, but there is a gender trait there that women don't put their hand up and lean in, as Sheryl Sandberg called it. I say this as a major generalization, but I think by encouraging and highlighting role models, there might be more of a desire to take that next leap. Thank you. It's an incredibly nuanced and complex conversation, and I can't assume to speak for everybody. And particularly, I guess, in an age of when we should be aiming for gender neutrality, it's a very difficult and very political subject to be even bringing up. But until there is an even playing field or an equality, I don't think we're nowhere near neutrality. So, there has to be equality before we get to neutrality. But, you referenced Marianne.
No, I'm not sure I have a lot of substantial things to add. I think to get back to the question of education, this is something not necessarily now gender-related, but for me now, we're here looking at Art Basel, we're sitting at Design Miami. I think design education is something, I haven't heard the design until I left high school. Like, you have art history at school and maybe a little bit of architecture history, but you never hear about design, at least now in let's say, Central European education. And these role models that you're referring to, I think you need to encounter them much earlier than at university. I think you need to encounter them at a younger age.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly in the UK, creative industries are being cut. There needs to be a balance within education, but creative industries are being cut, so there will come a time where design is where people won't even know that they can study design, let alone become a designer, and it will become a privileged minority who are practicing design, which is not a gender issue, but it has to start at education.
And one nuance I would maybe like to add, design is a collaborative effort. Design, in design normally you have a client, and also in the design process itself, you're rarely alone. And authorship is difficult when it's a collaborative effort. And then it comes back to, who stands up and waves and says it was me, and what's the name on it. So I think there's much more happening through women that becomes visible. And even how we can change that, I'm not sure I can answer that.
No. But thank you for raising it as a question. Silence. Can we just wait for the microphone?
Hello, everyone. Hello, Marianne. I'd like to know if if she weaved as well. Did she make tapestry?
No, she did not weave herself. She was not an artist, but she designed textile patterns. But they were mainly printed patterns, and a few of them were also woven. But it's a broad collection of decorative prints that she designed.
I see. No, I thought there was also handmade.
No, maybe samples in the process, but not as an output, because it was really serially produced work. So it's not at all comparable to Bertel's practice.
Okay, thank you.
I think the book is very interesting in terms of raising the issue and the questions, But I have a question. What does everybody feel is the current state? Do we think things are getting better? I'm guessing that we don't think the problem's been solved, but especially as a current practitioner, what do you all think? Where are we now, and how far, much further do we have to go?
Well, I think we're in a much better place. In my own experience, I haven't felt any problems because of my gender, of what I'm producing, and including set design, and that's a very male-oriented profession as well, including furniture design as well. It's a very male. So I feel very lucky of doing it at the moment, and I will be doing it for a long time, hopefully. So I feel like we're in a much better place than, I can concentrate on my work, but rather than like these designers, they had to go through a lot more, like Aileen Gray, like she had to fight something else in order to get to her work. But so I feel lucky in that way.
So we're saying the current situation is quite positive.
Quite
We're
positive in my
optimistic.
opinion, yes, especially with the whole Me Too thing happening, and it's alive.
Yes.
It's alive, which is, I think, a plus. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, this is for Libby and for the whole panel. So you're thinking about doing a volume 2. So what would not, if you could, include any other women that were not in the first volume? Who would they be, and who do you think is missing that needs to be included?
Okay, I think, as I said, I'd love there to be a volume 2. The publisher was waiting to see how sales go on this one. It actually only launched 2 days ago, so
Right.
it is very, very new, and this is its first official outing. So fingers crossed sales will do very well, and they will go with volume 2. As I mentioned, there are a lot of designers that I know exist, but I cannot access information about them. There was a Sri Lankan architect working in the 30s and 40s called Manette Dasilva, I hope I've got that right, who unfortunately, because her work was not particularly well known and she wasn't particularly well known, her work hasn't been preserved and it wasn't documented. And then there's a Japanese furniture designer who was in the 80s, who was, comparable, I guess, with Memphis, who is called Hisaka Watanabe. And again, it wasn't documented. So I'd have to go and do a lot more primary-based research, which unfortunately the schedule on this book didn't allow. So that would be the dream, is to go back to the roots, go back, go to Sri Lanka, go to Japan, do it myself. And I tried to cover as many disciplines and decades as possible within the scope of that, which is not enormously large. And so there's so many more disciplines left to work with, let alone designers. And we do everything pretty much except for fashion design in here: textile, vehicle, industrial, new media, digital, graphic, product, architecture. So within all those categories, there's just more. But as I say, the dream would be to be able to go and do much more primary research and document. But this is not going to solve the problem. It's going to help the conversation. And just I have many colleagues who are doing exactly what I'm describing. So I'm grateful to them for getting out there and doing the primary research. Well, I might put it back to you, actually. Who would you like to see as a conclusion? Anybody want to volunteer some names as to which female designers, contemporary or historical, need reappraisal or need reviewing or celebrating?
I think it would be interesting to look at the influence of Ray Ames, of Charles and Ray Ames, and to see her involvement within a husband and wife duo that was of a very large amount of influence from its period. And as much as I know, there was rather quite a lot of influence from Ray, and perhaps she might be one.
Absolutely. Interesting with the Eames, they are very well documented. And so in some ways you sort of shy away from that because you feel that you want to focus on somebody who's maybe not as well documented. But as we learnt with Lina Bo Bardi, that could be at the expense of one half of an entire body of work, in this case furniture, as opposed to all of her other projects. But that could be, not looking at the Eameses and that being at the expense of Ray. That's good.
Hello. Is there any reason why you've excluded fashion design?
No. no.
So there are a lot of more women maybe missing, like Coco to all the others.
I come from furniture and product design background, not a fashion design background, so I wrote what I felt comfortable writing.
Yeah, because fashion is some kind of, was very early already industrialized, and I'm always a little bit confused because in terms of what kind of design you're including, because it sounds like industrial, graphic, digital design sounds very modern or contemporary, but we talked about applied arts today, so I see there's for me it's the border between these two disciplines. Maybe fashion would be nice to add.
Absolutely. We do include some ceramics.
Right.
Yeah,
but it's not a single story. I mean, it's design basically.
No, as I say, it's purely because I had to write about where I've come from and what I've known for the last couple of decades of working in product and furniture. But you're absolutely right. It's tones.
So I don't know if you have mentioned Anna Maria Niemeyer.
No.
Okay. For next time.
Next time. I know. Apologies to everybody.
No, do you have an email where we can send suggestions?
Yeah.
We start to send you.
Anyway, well, can you please join me in thanking my wonderful panel?
Thank you, Libby, for having us.
Thank you.